You think you're better than me just because you've got money, Maria muttered under her breath, her hands shaking as she folded the crisp uniforms in the back room of the luxury boutique. She had been working tirelessly, overlooked and disrespected by one particular customer, Mrs. Thornton, a wealthy woman who loved flaunting her status and belittling those she deemed beneath her. Today, Mrs. Thornton had taken things too far, humiliating Maria in front of the entire store with cutting remarks about her appearance and financial status. The other employees stayed silent, fearful of losing their jobs. But what Mrs. Thornton didn't know was that life has a funny way of flipping the script. Just as Maria was ready to walk away in tears, a sudden turn of events left everyone in the store speechless, and Mrs. Thornton. She was about to learn that money can't buy class or escape from karma. Maria held her breath, her cheeks burning with embarrassment as Mrs. Thornton strutted toward the counter. The woman's voice dripped with arrogance as she demanded immediate attention, waving her expensive purse like a trophy. Maria tried to focus on her work, but the sting of Mrs. Thornton's cruel words earlier was still fresh. Maria had spent years juggling 2 jobs to support her family. She wasn't ashamed of her life, just tired of being judged for it. And yet, she stayed quiet, determined not to give Mrs. Thornton the satisfaction of seeing her break. What no one in the boutique knew was that Maria wasn't the only one hiding something. Mrs. Thornton, despite her designer clothes and polished appearance, wasn't as untouchable as she seemed. Secrets have a way of coming to light, and an unexpected visitor was about to step through those boutique doors, setting off a chain of events no one saw coming. The boutique door chimed, drawing everyone's attention. A tall, sharply dressed man walked in, carrying an air of authority that made the room go silent. Maria glanced up briefly, recognizing him as one of the store's regulars, a man who always treated the staff with kindness, no matter their position. He headed straight to the counter where Mrs. Thornton stood, her smug demeanor faltering ever so slightly. "Mrs. Thornton," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I believe we need to have a conversation." Maria couldn't hear everything they were saying, but it was clear that this wasn't a friendly chat. Mrs. Thornton's confident expression cracked as the man showed her something on his phone. Her voice grew defensive, her once haughty tone replaced with unease. In the corner, Maria continued folding clothes, trying to piece together what was happening. Something told her that whatever this man had just revealed, it was far bigger than her. The air in the boutique grew heavy as Mrs. Thornton's voice rose, trying to maintain control of the situation. "I don't know what you think you're accusing me of, but I have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped, her carefully crafted composure slipping with each word. The man, unfazed, calmly replied, "This isn't the place to make a scene, Mrs. Thornton, but I suggest you choose your next words carefully. We have enough evidence, and this is your chance to explain yourself." Maria's heart raced as she watched from a distance. What evidence? What could someone like Mrs. Thornton possibly have to hide? She kept her head down, trying to focus, but the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Thornton's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse tighter, glancing nervously at the employees and customers who were now watching her every move. Maria could feel that something monumental was about to happen, and whatever it was, it would change everything. Just as Mrs. Thornton opened her mouth to defend herself, the door chimed again, and a young woman walked in, her face pale but determined. She carried a folder in her hands, clutching it tightly as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Maria didn't recognize her, but the moment Mrs. Thornton saw her, her expression changed completely. Her usual arrogance dissolved into something close to panic. "Amelia," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice suddenly quieter, almost pleading. "What are you doing here?" The young woman ignored her and walked straight to the man. "I have everything you need," she said, handing him the folder. He flipped through the pages, nodding grimly. Maria's curiosity grew as whispers rippled through the boutique. Amelia turned to Mrs. Thornton, her voice trembling with both anger and resolve. "You thought no one would find out, but your lies. They've hurt too many people, and now it's time to face the truth. The room fell silent. Maria couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Mrs. Thornton, the untouchable, suddenly exposed and vulnerable. Whatever was in that folder, it was big, and Maria had a feeling this was far from over. The man scanned the contents of the folder, his expression hardening with every page. Mrs. Thornton stepped back, her voice shaking as she said, "This is absurd. You can't prove anything." But Amelia didn't flinch. "You stole from people who trusted you," Amelia said, her voice steady now. "Families, employees, you thought no one would connect the dots, but we did. These documents show everything, the fake accounts, the stolen funds. It's all here." A gasp echoed from one of the employees near the counter. Maria's heart pounded as she pieced it together. Mrs. Thornton, for all her wealth and attitude, wasn't the picture of success she pretended to be. Her empire had been built on lies. The man turned to Mrs. Thornton. "The authorities have already been informed. This is your chance to come clean, or they'll take it from here." Mrs. Thornton's face drained of color. She stumbled over her words, trying to justify herself, but the room wasn't buying it. As the tension reached its peak, she spun around and locked eyes with Maria. "You," she hissed, desperation leaking into her voice. "You've always hated me, haven't you? Did you help them?" Maria blinked, stunned. "Me," she said, stepping forward. "I had no idea this was happening. But maybe if you'd treated people with kindness instead of tearing them down, you wouldn't be standing here alone right now." The final twist came as Amelia pulled Maria aside. "Actually," she said softly, "you helped more than you know. That day you stood up for yourself and told her off. It gave me the courage to dig into what was really going on. You reminded me that no one deserves to be silenced." As Mrs. Thornton was escorted out, Maria felt an unfamiliar sense of relief. For the first time in years, the weight of silence was lifted, and in its place was something far more powerful: justice. As the boutique quieted down, Maria stood by the counter, still processing everything that had just unfolded. The employees whispered among themselves, their shocked expressions slowly giving way to relief. For years, Mrs. Thornton had been untouchable, treating people however she pleased. But today, justice had finally caught up with her. Amelia approached Maria again, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You reminded me that standing up for what's right is worth it," she said. "You don't realize how much strength you gave me." Maria smiled faintly, humbled by the words. She had never seen herself as strong, just someone trying to get by. But maybe in her quiet resilience, she had made a difference after all. As Maria returned to her work, the boutique felt lighter, almost free. And though the scars of Mrs. Thornton's cruelty might linger, Maria knew one thing for certain: kindness and integrity would always win in the end.